Hi guys, so today I wanted to talk about the Franklin expedition. I was watching a show on Hulu. It was called The Terror, and it was actually based on the book called The Terror that was a fictitious take on events that happened during the Franklin expedition. And I just thought it was really interesting because a lot of stuff happened. I've never heard about it before. I think Wendy Goon talked about it, and then before I heard it on this show. So basically, the Franklin expedition was a British expedition set out to explore the Arctic. More specifically, it was to explore the Northwest Passage. This was a route between the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. The purpose of the expedition was to record magnetic data to help with navigation. This was considered the worst naval expeditions of not just like Britain, but like of all of like naval polar expeditions because of the events that happened to the ships and the men. Let's just say that it did not go well for them. At the time, this expedition was the most well-equipped expedition to explore that region. In the year 1845, they sent two ships out on this expedition. They were called the HMS Terror and the Erebus. The leading ship, which was the larger ship, was the Erebus, and it was commanded by Sir John Franklin, and he was actually the commander of the entire expedition. And the other ship, which was a slightly smaller ship, was called the Terror, and that was led by Francis Crozier, and he was technically second in command. I just feel like the names of the ships was kind of like almost like an ominous foreshadowing almost, because apparently Erebus means darkness, and it is the place of darkness between Earth and Hades. And then obviously the Terror is also a scary name. Maybe it was some kind of a tradition to name ships like that back then, but it kind of is like a foreshadowing to the events that did take place to these 129 men aboard these ships. So it had many provisions in place, including scientific instruments, books, salted meats, biscuits, tobacco, ale, spirits, 3 years worth of canned foods, soups, preserved vegetables, lime juice for scurvy. It was equipped with steam engines. It even had steam heating and equipment to produce fresh water. So these ships were really nice. Like, they weren't, broken down or anything like that. They even had a dog called Neptune on aboard the ship. And Sir Franklin's wife, Madam Jane, she had gifted him a pet monkey, which was called Jacko, to him when at the beginning of the expedition. And they also had a cat for chasing down the mice. So the expedition was going well for about a whole year. They set out in 1845 and it was going really well. There was no issues. I think they were even recorded to be seen along the route by other boats. And then in September of 1846, the ships had become stuck in the ice. And at this point, there were a few casualties. Like 3 men had died at this point due to unknown causes, but it was still like not going really bad. I mean, I guess it's expected to have a few casualties. And they did expect to be, stuck in the ice at some point because this was going through the Arctic, there was a lot of ice and stuff like that. So after, when the ships got stuck, they basically decided to just wait out until the summer and spring for the ice to melt aboard the ship. And then they would keep traveling after the ice had been melted the following year. So then in 1847, the crew is still aboard the ships, but they do send out a small party of about 8 men to explore the island and basically find a campsite so that the men can come off the ship and just be on the island for a little bit, because at this point they probably had lost some hope that the ice was going to melt anytime soon, because by this point it had been more than a year that they had been stuck in the ice. The small party does make camp at Cape Felix, and they do stay there for a while from about May until December, and around that time, it was one of my sources said that they made a hasty return to the ship. We don't know what the causes were, but they just basically returned to the ship at the end of that year. It was also during this year that there was a note. Sir John Franklin, the commander of the entire expedition, died on June 11th. So I would say like around this year is when it started to, kind of start looking bleak for them, especially since when a commander of the whole expedition dies, it's definitely not a good morale on the men, So because of Sir John Franklin's death, Captain Francis Crozier now becomes the commander of the expedition, leaving James Fitzjames, what a name, right? Who was on the same ship as Sir John Franklin, in charge of the Erebus. All these names can get kind of confusing because a lot of them sound kind of similar to me, at least. So at this point, Sir John Franklin died, Francis Crozier is now the commander, and James Fitzjames is the second in command. Pretty much. So going to next year, 1848, things are starting to look really bad at this point. They had started using the Terror as a mortuary to place all the dead bodies. I assume they had lost all hope of the ships being able to get out of the ice. I think at this point they probably wanted to find different shelter, maybe find different sources of food. So in April 22nd, Francis Crozier and 105 other men deserted the ships and head out towards the main island, which was considered to be King William's Island. They also put 2 small boats together on sleds that the men would pull along with them as they were setting out for the main island. In 1849, the men had actually run into some Inuit hunters, and they started to hunt together some like wild fowl and I think some other game in the area. So they were able to get some food, which is good. I would say like at this point when they deserted the ships, like people didn't know why they deserted the ships because they still had food on the ships, and it was looking all very weird and mysterious as to why they would abandon the ship. They could have just stayed there, but from the events that I'll tell you later, it will basically explain why they deserted the ships and why they stopped eating the canned foods. So the next part is kind of like we don't know for sure when this happened, but from around 1849 to 1850, we think is when Francis Crozier dies. And then in 1850, according to Inuit accounts, they do see a group of about 40 men heading east and leaving some men behind. And this account was actually the last known sighting of them. And then basically they are never heard from again until about 160 years later when the ships were discovered by like divers around the Canada regions in actually really good shape. In the year 1848 is also when Sir John Franklin's wife Jane really pressed the Admiralty, British Navy to do a rescue mission for the men, because at this point I think the British Navy wasn't that worried about it, but she kind of had a feeling that something was wrong, and she was really the one that was outspoken about trying to find these men and trying to bring them back. The Navy did send out a series of search and rescue missions to find out what happened to the men. So basically after, they found the men, and they did do some autopsies on the bodies, and just like from examining the scenes, the campsites and everything, and also from Inuit accounts, this is basically what happened to the men and how they perished. It was a combination of lead poisoning, exposure to the elements, and cannibalism. Yeah, it actually did get to that point, which is really crazy. Basically, all 129 men perished from the expedition. And that's why it's considered the worst expedition of the polar that ever happened, because all the men died. In this region, the temperature dropped below negative 48 degrees Celsius overnight and negative 35 degrees Celsius during the day. So it was really freaking cold. There was ice everywhere. There was freezing fog. There was a source that I read where like when they were pulling the sleds, if they would, even though it's really cold outside, you know, they were still able to like sweat. And if they stopped pulling on the sleds, they would actually start to have ice crystals forming in their underwear because that's how cold it would get. So yeah, you can just imagine like how cold this area was. When I was watching the show, the women, there was a scene where Jane was saying how she would go outside and just step her feet into a pile of snow, and she couldn't even take it for more than a few minutes. And you imagine these men were there for years, you know, dealing with this coldness, this bitter coldness. So when I was watching the show and thinking about it, I just thought it was really crazy, like how much humans can endure, and like we can't imagine what they went through and how hard that must have been. But I did see a source that mentioned that although there was very harsh elements to the environment they were in, there was also great beauty, you know, glowing lights, the aurora borealis, and that can all be very beautiful as well as very dangerous and very unwelcoming at the same time. So obviously all that cold could lead to like hypothermia, like frostbitten body parts, and that could also lead to great gangrene if like the body parts weren't getting enough oxygen and blood flow. After examining the bodies, they realized that a lot of these men died from lead poisoning, because if you remember what I said at the beginning, they were sent out with like about 3 years worth of canned foods, and if they had, you know, like spaced it out, it would have been able to last them for like about 5 years potentially. But they use a new method to seal these canned foods right before they were given to these ships. And that method of sealing the canned foods actually contaminated the food with lead. So these men were consuming all these foods that were lined with lead. There was an account that said that one of the doctors on the ship, Dr. Good Sir, he had suspected that there was lead poisoning going on. So sadly, they tested it out on the monkey, Jacko, and had him eat a can of food. And when he, you know, died, they did an autopsy on him and realized he died from lead poisoning. So it was said that the men did know that later on that the cans were contaminated with lead. And that must have been very painful, because some of the symptoms of lead poisoning are joint and muscle pain, irritability, headaches, memory and concentration issues, mood disorders, abdominal pain. So it's definitely not a fun thing to have. Another issue would have been like scurvy, you know, lack of vitamin C. And they did have lime juice on the ships, but at some point they would have gone bad and they would have dealt with the symptoms of scurvy. One cool thing I learned was that I was wondering during this time, like, how did Inuit people get stuff like vitamin C? And it's because the foods that they eat a lot of the foods raw, like the meats raw, and and when you eat certain meats raw, it actually provides sources of vitamins, and that's why Inuit people don't suffer from scurvy or anything. And another issue was tuberculosis. Tuberculosis was pretty common back then. There wasn't a cure for it. Being in these tight conditions, they would have been spreading it amongst themselves, and some of them men probably died from tuberculosis. This was based on the exhumation of the bodies later on. They were actually in quite a good condition because of how cold the Arctic was. The main thing, which is cannibalism. So because the food went bad, or the food had lead poisoning, and they weren't able to hunt wild game. That 1 year when they were able to hunt game, it was mainly during the spring and the summer, but during the winter there would be nothing for them to hunt. So they would have been really hungry and starving at this point. I think based on the exhumation of the bodies, they were very emaciated. And how they found this out was that when they found the bodies of the men, they did find like knife marks on the bones, and they found evidence of like breaking and heating on the bones, meaning that the bones were basically broken into and heated to get the bone marrow out of them. And then kind of interesting thing that I found was that there were layers there were like different levels of cannibalism. Like first is when people starts to like go for the big muscle groups. And yeah, when things get more dire, people tend to crack the bones in order to get the bone marrow that is inside. The Inuit people actually had an account that said that when they saw the campsites of the men, there were actually body parts in the cooking pots. So this account was from John Ray, which is one of the people who were set out to do a search and rescue and find out what happened to the men. This is based on the Inuit account of what happened. He said that, quote unquote, from the mutilated state of many of the bodies and the contents of the kettles, it is evident that our wretched countrymen had been driven to the last dread alternative as a means of sustaining life. A few of the unfortunate men must have survived until the arrival of the wild fowl, say until end of May, as shots were heard and fresh bones and feathers of the geese were noticed near the scene of the sad event. When John Ray actually reported these findings back to, the British, they did not believe it. They didn't think that the men were capable of that. These were noblemen, these were men of high class. They didn't believe it. They actually blamed it on the Inuit people, saying that they were somehow responsible for it. But now it's all confirmed that it did happen and that there is evidence of this. So it's not an assumption or theory that this happened. Like, they actually did do this. Yeah, that's basically what happened to them. And I just have to say, like, although they had to resort to that, the fact that they did do this mission and that they signed up to be one of the first explorers of the polar region like this was really amazing. I can't imagine doing something like that, something that hard. You can just imagine being there for years, away from your family, and being in such harsh environments in order to increase the knowledge of the area back then. That's just a really amazing thing that they set out to do. One of the positive sides of the Franklin expedition was that all the search and rescue missions that was sent out to find the men, they actually explored thousands of miles of that region, and they probably wouldn't have done as much exploration if not that they were trying to find the men. And yeah, I would recommend checking out the show The Terror if you're interested in watching a fictional show based on the characters from the actual expedition on Hulu. I thought it was really interesting. It does get a little bit gory, so I'll warn you about that. And not all the events in there are true, but it's definitely interesting, and it definitely makes you think about what the men really went through and how brave they were. So yeah, I just thought this expedition was very interesting. It's something that I just thought so interesting. I researched about it, so I just thought I'd share it, and hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.